Let me begin with a little bit of a history, at least from my perspective, as I entered this world of writing research, or writing and writing-related research. As you're aware, I became quite interested in these issues of authorships in the late 70s, and so entered the field of writing, started looking at their journals in earnest, researching the teaching of English, college English, written communication, college composition, and in the elementary sector, language arts. And what I discovered there was really a sort of a massive field, a little bit of separation of subfields. But one of the things that had been occurring in the writing area was a lot of research in the composing process. Very interesting work, beginning with Janet Emmig's case studies of writers, and Mina Shaughnessy's analyses of errors, and two cognitive psychologists somewhat, Linda Flower and John Hayes from Carnegie Mellon, who were doing think alouds with the writers and developed a process model of writing, which I'll share with you shortly. And Anne Bertolf, and who talked about composing and imagination. And Mike Rose, whose work was quite fascinating. He wrote an interesting book on writer's block, drawing a lot from his own experience and analysing what it was in the cognitive processes of the composing processes of writers that sometimes becomes the obstacle in terms of their progressing and so on. This work was not at all, didn't appear to be at all related to the schema theoretic work that was going on in reading. It was fresh, it was grounded in really rich think aloud data and other analyses. In some ways it sort of mirrored a little bit of the Ken Goodman Miscue type of work, at least some of the work by Shaughnessy, but it was more extensive, and it was quite rich. I think some of the people who were traditional, who had been doing writing research, were a little frustrated by its emphasis on mental processes. Because I also discovered a rich history of practical theorists around the teaching of writing, particularly college writing, or writing at the college level, by people like Moffat and people like Don Murray, who had been a Pulitzer Prize winner for the Boston Globes and was still writing for the Boston Globes. Murray was at New Hampshire and was doing a lot of interesting writing about the writer as a reader, and helping writers read their own writing in fairly sophisticated, strategic sorts of ways. Peter Elbow's work, which also extended into the assessment area, Charles Cooper, Lester Fagley, Steve Whitty, and Bruce Britton from the UK. This group here I would consider to be sort of like practical theorists, although Charles Cooper had also done a lot of work in the area of evaluation. And Lester was also doing a lot of sort of database work. But these were folks who were analysing practices in deep, rich and complex sort of ways, which went far beyond, as far as I could see, the theories or the models that were emerging here. They were extraordinary practical theorists. And at the same time, and this was connected somewhat with the writing field, you began to see emerging a good bit of research which basically was focused on early writing, and raised the hypothesis, which is that if you want to help children read, that maybe a better vehicle than some of our practices of introducing kids to the alphabet or letter names is actually through giving them opportunities to write. And you had Carol Chomsky and Charles Reed and Amelia Freire and Teal and Soulsby, Bill Teal and Elizabeth Soulsby, doing really interesting work looking at early reading, but also from the lens of writing development. Carroll coined the term invented spelling, but it fitted in with the sort of psycholinguistic views of the child as an active language learner, developing systems for writing which gradually unfold and become refined and develop into conventional sorts of conventional writing. Stunning sort of work, but basically sort of potentially getting us to sort of shift from approach to reading, which focused on reading by itself, to an approach to reading which actually began with writing, recognizing that some of the best source for early reading materials was kids actually engaged in what might be considered scribbles, invented spellings, and other representations en route to conventional reading. Then, apart from the research on writing, there were quite a few other areas that were informing all of this work. One was studies of rhetoric, and particularly related to bringing an understanding of rhetoric into the teaching. And Canavy, who I think was at Texas at this time, and some colleagues that were working in Australia at that time with Michael Halliday, Martin and Christie, who were focused on genre issues and were very concerned about helping readers and writers understand features of genres and using those understandings of what they call the genres of power. And then you had literary theorists, which included, Stanley Fish, as there were texts in the classroom, and David Bleich, who was very much interested in interpretive communities, and Alan Purvis, who was interested in the full range of literary theoretical conversations, and Rick Beach. What's interesting as you look across this is how rich this work was. And to a large extent, it was being done apart from work in reading. Although people in reading particularly were interested in issues of rhetoric and literary theory, that there wasn't, you couldn't really see the influences of this work, at least extensively, in terms of reading practice or reading theory. What's also interesting is that probably apart from Flower and Hayes, I'm not sure any of these people are educational psychologists. And so they come into this area with a very different disposition, a very different history, a very different way of knowing. And the range of things they're doing as researchers is quite different. To a large extent, doing things which are a little bit more case-based, whether it be an analysis of text or analyses of writers, much more case-based than what we were sort of seeing happening in reading. Indeed, related to the early writing stuff, what was spurred in terms of in the field were enormous number of case studies of young children by their parents. Taking the understandings of some of these people that I've talked about to sort of look at their development over the years. But it was interesting as you entered this field. I sort of realized, wow. I began with a sort of an interest in author-reader relationships, which I picked up to some extent in looking at the people in rhetoric and communication theory, and also in this area. But I quickly discovered that there was an amazing richness and diverse work that was occurring in these areas. Now, I've just given you some of these areas, but they also went beyond that to areas that were of particular interest to me, areas like drawing upon almost Greek concepts of ethos, areas dealing with persona and voice, and issues of meta-discourse, and so on. So it proved to me to be a very different sort of thing from a sort of a simple sort of minded, let's get into looking at author-reader relationships through what we know about authorship, to come into grips with the fact that this was a massive amount of work. Now, my approach as a person getting into this was sort of like a historian. I did what historians might call sort of post-holing. I sort of dug in deeply to a few of these areas, and as I dug in deeply, I found myself having these amazing experiences in conjunction with what I said earlier, this sort of recontextualizing by analogy, and beginning to sort of say to myself, well, these people aren't terribly data-based. Maybe I should get some data to see if, in fact, I can sort of add to the discussions. Historically, much of the work in this area was driven by the discussions more than data, from my perspective. But I was sort of stunned by the amount of work in this area and how multifaceted it was, how rich it was, and the extent to which it wasn't sort of driven by this sort of behavioristic, observable tendencies that we saw in the reading research.